Hello, welcome back for the afternoon sessions, and good that you're still staying with us. I have now the pleasure to introduce the moderator for the next panel. The panel is on women's rights movement, technology and digitalization opportunities. And we are very pleased to have Ms. Carla Haddad-Martini as the moderator of this panel. She is serving as the director at the UNICEF Public Partnership Division. And before she was working for the International Committee of the Red Cross and has also experiences on the field in the Middle East and Africa. She holds a bachelor in philosophy and political science from the American University of Beirut and a master's degree in comparative literature from Dartmouth College and a master's degree in international relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Welcome, and thank you for moderating this panel. Thank you, Ms. Martini.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure and an honor to be moderating this panel. I have to say you have a deep bench of women on this panel, having interacted with a couple of them as we were preparing. What I suggest we do, because I know it's after breakfast or lunch or dinner, depending on where you are in the world, I suggest that I introduce each panelist briefly before they start. We will start with Mrs. Hind Kabawat because she has to exit for other commitments. So I'll introduce her briefly, just so you know you've all received the bios and they speak for themselves. So I will not run through the entire bio. I'll just say a few words about her and then open the floor to her. So Hind Kabawat is the deputy head of the Syrian Negotiation Commission in Geneva and director and adjunct professor of interfaith peace building at George Mason University Center for World Religions, Diplomacy, and Conflict Resolution. In 2007, she was awarded the Peacemakers in Action Award from the Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding in New York. Additionally, she is on the board of Tasta'il, being independent in Arabic, a women organization dedicated to using nonviolence and dialogue to address the ongoing conflict in Syria. Tasta'il runs 5 education women's centers in southern Turkey and inside Syria, teaching 500 internally displaced people, refugees, and local women mediation and peace building every year. I didn't do justice to her bio. It's a long one with a lot of interesting moments in her career. Please refer to her bio. And without further ado, I'll hand over the floor to you, Mrs. Kabawat. Over to you.
Thank you, Carla. And you forget that we graduated from the same school. So I was
very happy to learn that.
Me too. Thank you. Another pleasure. Just thank you so much for being here. It's just like it's an honor for me to be with this impressive women panel, and thank you for inviting me. And I follow the Webster University work here in Geneva, and they're doing amazing work. So of course, good afternoon from Geneva. And this week, as you know, it's the 4th round for the Constitution Committee, facilitated by Pedersen. He's the special envoy of Syria. And of course, we hope the discussions will be productive and we can be able to stop the conflict and the war in Syria. And saying this, let me start telling you how women have been impacted by nearly 10 years of conflict in Syria. And the Syrian refugee women are forced to cope in foreign countries with limited access to resources. Women have traditionally had reduced access to vocational training in Syria. And now they face supporting their families and both economically and emotionally with minimum resources. This leaves women and girls more vulnerable to early marriages, radicalization, or occupation that place them at risk of physical or sexual violence. By providing empowerment and psychosocial support our organization create opportunities for these women to regain their agency, influence, and impact their families and communities. Our NGO have its own staff and volunteers. And we work very close with George Mason University, the Center of Religion and Diplomacy. And we are committed to making the voice of Syrian women heard. And we have graduates who succeeded in being present in local and international negotiations to help develop solutions to both immediate family. So this challenge have say in creating lasting political solution for all of us. We emphasize four primary themes: its resilience, empathy, peace building, and mediation. By addressing also, we added the social support, because we have to deal with the stress and the trauma that Syrian women have experienced, and we still experience it. So this has enabled us to build the confidence and the resilience they need to lead and themselves to empower other women and members of their communities. Of course, empathy is the core element of their education activities. And the most effective leaders are those that can represent the entirety of their diverse communities, finding unity by celebrating differences and distinctions. So our program based on several important areas to ensure women empowerment. And the curriculum is, we have courses designed to teach individuals how to engage in constructive, respectful debate. As you know, we've been 50 years under dictatorship, so the culture of debate and the culture of dialogue does not exist in Syria. And so we talk about topic might be traditionally be considered controversial, emphasizing tolerance and using dialogue to build understanding through exposure to new ideas and identities. Also, we teach a lot about peace building in a proactive approach to rethink peace and work about conflict from peace and cooperation perspective, and to underscore the importance of women's active participation in society, of course, in order to reduce the armed conflict. 3, mediation. Mediation for us, it's our main mission, because I believe in all my colleagues, and now we see them now in Geneva at the negotiation table, they are the powerful forces for sustainable peace when empowered with the required skill in mediating and negotiating. 4th, we have the governance and leadership. These courses are designed to improve student awareness of local governance, election leadership skills, as well as international humanitarian law. Of course, I mentioned before, we offer the classes of psychosocial support to enable us to gain confidence. So just to make it very brief, our curriculum obtain the conflict resolution and negotiation skill, women leadership and public speaking, peaceful and dialogue, and empathy and resilience. The courses include, of course, both theory and practice, with many projects to implement what they have learned in their own local context. Of course, the objective of our program and our work is to proactively engage and empowering Syrian women in Turkey and Syria from different religions and ethnic groups in order to improve their quality of living, lay the foundation of redevelopment of Syria post-conflict, and develop a more inclusive and tolerant culture and political environment, of course. Through this, we aim to contribute actively and meaningfully toward a non-violent transition to an inclusive, secure, and sustainable peace in Syria. This accomplished through coursework, lecture series by invited guest speaker, and group activities. The training are designed to allow women to equip themselves and other women to have more access to political and diplomatic channels, to advocate for women empowerment and peaceful political access to internationally recognized leaders in conflict resolution and mediation, interfaith dialogue, international religious and sectarian divide. Of course, we face challenges. We all work in organization. We all work on challenges. So our primary challenge is facing our current centers in the past for the COVID-19. For last March, we switched all our program completely to remote learning under COVID-19. This is to ensure the safety and well-being to our staff and students, and also comply with the medical recommendation by the local and international authority. So what we did, we kept the student engaged during distance learning. And we know that is very difficult. Believe me, it's difficult. Instead of being in a center, now you are dealing with a distant learning. But of course, can be more difficult, but particularly for longer training session. And while electricity shortage and low quality of internet, and especially in the refugee camps and the IDP camps, so it will impact the student ability to join and participate in sessions. Therefore, breaks and interactive exercise we use by the trainers to help keep students alert and engaged with the session. And usually it's very challenging. Also, so we turned our challenge, you see, to work for us by being committed to teaching and training, even if the circumstances have changed. Also, we took advantage of the online training by bringing Syrians closer to each other. So we mix online learning with the students from different parts of Syria, from different religions, ethnic and sectarian backgrounds. This helped us a lot to create a natural and organic manner opportunity for dialogue and interaction among Syrian women from different backgrounds. Remember, many of our students, they during the years of conflict, they've been having isolations. They were kept apart from each other and from the rest of the Syrian society. So this is get them access to the outside world or the means to communicate, network, and connect with others. So we see that you're watching the news that the Kurds and Arab are fighting, and Christian, they're all together in this online course, learning together because of this amazing program. So this created a safe place for those women to dialogue and talk despite all these conflicts happening around them. So since of many students expressed interest also to remain in contact, so we created this program that every 2 weeks we get all these alumni and we have a guest speakers, and sometimes a very challenging one. Like we get somebody to challenge him, and the women, they love it now. They've been from north to south, east to west. They're all working and helping each other. Also, they just added this very interesting discussion group. It's called Interfaith and Intersectarians group. So they want to talk about these issues. And believe me, online, it makes it a little bit easier because we could connect them, and there is no war and there is no border among them. So they are from various backgrounds. They're Christian, Muslim, Druze, Ismaili, Alawite, Kurds, Arab, Yazidis. And this particular group was found around the theme of identity and dialogue skills. It was designed to create ongoing discussions about interfaith and intersectarian issues in Syria, and to create a different paradigm. The trainees, with the help of our instructors, design a project now, and they're working together on this project. And this is to how to be part of their, to be all of them part of the Syrian heritage, and the resource to create viable democracy together. So with the challenge of COVID-19 and closing of our physical centers in various locations, the online learning and the meeting on Zoom with multi-ethnicity and religious students further enable Syrian women from across Syria, north, south, east, west, to meet and enter into difficult conversations. They were able to, the first time in many years, to have deep, meaningful conversation about subject matters and close to our heart. Mostly, and this is, I'm so proud of them, mostly the centering of how to rebuild our society together. So when everybody trying to get piece of the cake, and they're all men and all the politicians are talking about their interests, our women, they're talking about how we can move forward and how we can build the society together. So despite, of course, the difficulties and the challenges we face in switching the class from physical classes in a new modern online classroom, took us time in training and getting group for supporting and more internet data for the women in the refugee camps. But let me share with you the result before I close. They share their stories of conflict and war, and they have been sharing experience of survival and coping, actually, and others' difficulties. Number two, and this is so important, and I can see it now, there is a fatigue now with the Syrian conflict. So those women now, they're sharing pain, and the pain of thinking together how to find a way to heal. And now I can see that in these online classes, because it's a safe place, they are healing together. Third, they are also motivating each other with their successful stories. Every day there is a successful stories. I can have like days to tell you about the successful story, how this woman from Sweden get connected with women in Idlib, and now they are working together, and how this Yazidis woman with this Sunnis woman, they've been working in a project together. This is not a successful story. This is the real Syrian stories. And of course, they are coordinating and sharing together their project. And togetherness, they are, even if they have different geographic locations, but they are being able to work because of this program. Before I end, I get a little bit always emotion when I talk about my sisters and my daughters and my mothers. And I can tell you that there is a common phrase about knowledge is power, but in our age, believe me, we need to think a little differently about this phrase. We need to think about the power knowledge of new ways, how we can get the information and how we can learn together. And of course, in our current world, we can see the arms and the weapons and nuclears and all this. They think it's a power. But in the end, we can see that the real power from the people and coming together and working together. And a real knowledge is not just sciences, and not that come to the lab and discovering a new way of all the science, but no, the knowledge to help us in making peace, ending poverty and conflict, and finding way to protect each other and our environment, and knowledge to know how to create sustainable and defined life for all of us on this planet. This kind of knowledge, we can say that this is the real power. And believe me, my colleagues, every morning I woke up in the morning and I say, okay, that's it. I'm going to give up this work. It's too fatigued for me. I'm tired. But believe me, and I have 100 reasons to give up. But also the power of this woman, they give me thousands of reasons to continue and think that will have a reason for all of us to continue. So thank you, Carla. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me to speak on behalf of the Syrian women, to be the voice of the voiceless, and to give me opportunity to tell you how we switch the challenge of not having a physical classroom to have online to start our reconciliation and rebuilding our Syria. Thank you so much, colleagues.
Thank you, Hind, for a very inspirational first presentation. You will see on the chat box there were some reactions. I just want to check with you two things. First, will you be able to stay with us a little longer until we reach the Q&A, or should we ask you the two questions that came in the chat box to respond live very quickly, succinctly,
Okay.
or you respond in the chat box?
Let me just a moment. I have just a moment. The course you are talking about available for the public. So can we have access to it? Actually, we created, okay, Nada. Thank you, Nada. Shall I answer directly now, Carla, or because I have to leave?
So let me tell you what we can do.
I can write, you want me to write it?
Yes, I would say write them. But Hind, I just wanted on behalf of everyone to thank you for this. It's fascinating to see how the digital access and online, the move from physical to online has actually broken the barriers and the silos between these women. So it's fascinating to hear you. And just on your last point of giving up, as a good Fletcherite, I don't think you'll give up. I'm sure you're engaged in back channel negotiations everywhere. So
we learned it from the school, right?
We learned it together, so I'm sure you won't give up, and the women are relying on you. A big thank you to you. And now whilst you answer the questions on the chat box, we will move from Geneva to New York, where we will meet Anna Therese Day. So I'm just checking if Anna is on video. Here she is. She's waved with yes. Welcome, Anna Therese Day. Anna Therese Day is American. She's based in New York. She's the award-winning international reporter. She's an award-winning international reporter and filmmaker, primarily focusing on international politics, social movements, and women's rights in the Middle East. Her work has been featured in a variety of media outlets, including CNN, Al Jazeera English, and the New York Times, as well as international film festivals, including Cannes and Tribeca. So you will read her bio. Again, it speaks for itself. As I said at the beginning, a deep bench of women. Anna Therese, without further ado, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Hello, everyone from the United States today, and thank you so much to the organizers and all of the fellow panelists and participants today for bringing together such a terrific discussion, despite these extraordinarily difficult times that we're living through. So today, to avoid treading on any of the same ground as my fellow panelists, I thought that I'd focus on the interaction between women's movements in the Arab world with similar efforts globally in order to bring a bit of a comparative perspective on women's movements' use of technology. And then secondly, and moving forward, I wanted to contribute thoughts on comparative points of opportunity and competitive advantage that I see for women's advancement in the Middle East moving forward, specifically structural and technical trends in the region. So my talk today is based in my work as a reporter in the Middle East for the past decade, but I cover the intersection of movements and technologies worldwide. And it's from that position that I've been able to see this comparative view and also see that just how much the women's use of social media for social justice in the past decade in MENA truly stands out globally. So that brings me kind of to this first point of the interaction between movements and how some different movements in the Arab world have interacted with feminist and women's movements worldwide, really shown some leadership from starting trends in the tactical use of technology that moved from south to north, but also multipolar movements that interacted with women's movements in different parts of the world. We are approaching 10 years since the Arab Spring, exploded and shook not only countries in the region, but really set a trend for the world. I think people forget now that the use of social media for social justice at that level, and that politicization of this technology was unprecedented at the time. It will always be the model for tech companies on how technology that was developed for a certain commercial purpose was repurposed in different contexts, in different markets from their point of view, for something totally revolutionary and political. So it was significant. And again, since we're approaching January 25th, all of us will remember Asma Mahfouz, an Egyptian activist, getting on YouTube demanding that fellow citizens come to the streets if they have any dignity. And of course, on January 25th, and of course, we all know the story from there. But that, what we also saw from, not Egypt, not just inspiring movements in the Middle East, but around the world that summer in Tahrir Square, where there were encampments, there were activists from other Arab countries, women's activists, organizers of all sorts of different movements. But there were also organizers of women's movements coming from Gaza, coming from the Congo, coming from the United States. So really it was like a hub for revolutionary activity in this moment where there were open borders and there was safety, and before there was a lot of deterioration in safety. Another kind of and that was a period of sharing tactical communication strategies, but also safety strategies, which were so, again, early on. That was something that social media and these tools were first celebrated before people started to realize that they can be weaponized very quickly by governments. So these were things that were being developed in real time, that were being shared around the world across women's movements, and were utilized by women's movements elsewhere that had security concerns. The second was another example I wanted to give was early Me Too type movements that we saw. One of the most significant early moments in the Arab Spring was in Libya with Iman al-Obeidi, and her story of alleged sexual assault is something that was transformational in the politics and how the world saw the Libyan revolution at the time. And it was women organizers that stepped up to make sure that her story was not seen alone. It was not turned against her. It was something that women embraced. And from my reporting, what I saw in Eastern liberated Libya at the time was not just women organizers working on these issues and amplifying this story, but doing so with women's led publications where ownership was early on identified as an important part of women's publishing and getting these kinds of stories to the forefront with the right tone and feminist point of view. So again, early Me Too organizing from using the internet for this kind of messaging early on. Of course, we've also seen online organizing for offline results. We've seen that for sexual harassment all over the region. Some of apps have been developed. The strategies that were deployed have been used all over the world, from India to the United States, but were developed in places like Egypt and other Arab countries. Then I also wanted to bring up one that a movement that I find, it's not specifically a women's movement, but a women's-led movement that I find incredibly inspiring and really interesting in its kind of reflection of one of the most famous women's movements in the world, the Madres of Argentina, who were organizing to have some accountability for the disappeared in their civil war. We have those movements for the disappeared in Syria, in Egypt, and Palestine. Many of those movements are led by women and their families looking for their loved ones and using technology in really interesting ways to amplify those movements while concealing and protecting those demanding their families back. I also find those movements very interesting because it unites more pluralist human rights activists with Islamist feminists and Islamist groups that we see around the region. And I see that collaboration between women's leaders as a huge point of opportunity for solidarity for women from different backgrounds. So those are some points that, if anybody is interested, I'm sure we have so many women on this panel and in the audience today who are part of these movements or specialize in these movements. Then moving forward, some points of opportunity that I wanted to identify. Like women in the vast majority of countries in the world, women in the Arab world still disproportionately absorb social ills and inequalities of society. Some of those indicators are among the worst in the world. Others are, of course, exacerbated depending on class or by country specific. That said, MENA countries, even those that are lower income or struggling with active conflict, do have some structural trends that put them ahead of other developing regions. Those three kind of structural areas that I wanted to highlight are internet penetration and innovation funds, whether from the public sector, innovative programs by government, NGOs, and then increased private direct investment. Those are, can end up helping women in the context of MENA, and I'll get to that in a second, but again, would bring in partnerships from the economic sector. And then the last is STEM education. I think the STEM education piece is so important moving forward. According to UNESCO, we have 34 to 57% of STEM graduates in the Arab countries are women, depending on country. That's a figure that's much higher than at universities in most regions of the world, including the West. Some of women surveyed in some countries show that they are more comfortable with mathematics and science based on science-based subjects than male counterparts. Again, that is unique to the Arab world compared to other countries. There are limiting forces in terms of women actually with those advanced degrees actually being part of the formal job market, but we're seeing that, again, unlike many other regions, 1 in 3 startups are founded or led by women, which, those can be done from home. That limit some of the costs, whether they be physical safety or childcare and other costs that women face. So these indicators I wanted to raise, particularly in the time of COVID, as extremely, significant in creating a competitive economic edge, which of course translates to empowerment of women and girls, but also identify as points of intentional feminist allyship or investment or power analysis for women's movements themselves. Also approaching alliances and funding, which is, a challenge for women's organizers and civil society everywhere on earth. So to conclude, I just wanted to wrap that up so that we can have plenty of time for questions at the end. But that is what I thought, I could contribute today, is a bit of comparative perspective of how these movements have really stood out in the past decade, where we've seen this explosion worldwide of digital organizing, but also, again, moving forward, how women's movements could continue to channel and seize upon these kind of structural points of opportunity that exist in MENA.
Thank you, Anna Therese. It's also very interesting to see the angle you've chosen for this talk. And you touched on many things that I hope will trigger questions during the Q&A, the internet penetration, the private direct investments, the collaboration across public and private. What I really like in the way you speak about it is your notion of point of opportunity, and you bring that in different intersections. So I guess we'll keep that for the final Q&A session. Thank you for very interesting elements. And without further ado, we'll move to Lebanon, where Hayat Mirshad. So I'm Lebanese, so at least I share that with Hayat. And I lived in New York, so I share that with Anna Therese. And I studied at the Fletcher School, so I share that with Hind. Hayat, let me just introduce you. You're the co-founder and co-director at Female NGO. You're a feminist activist, journalist, trainer, and communications and advocacy expert. For the past 12 years, Hayat advocated for women's and girls' rights in Lebanon. In 2013, she co-founded and now co-directs Female, a civil feminist collective that works with women and girls to eliminate injustice through building a young feminist movement, empowering agents of change. You're the editor-in-chief of the online feminist platform Sharika, meaning partner, partnership. Sharika walakin, partnering but something, a partner but not yet equal, to promote feminism and gender equality, and to ensure that girls, women, LGBTQI+ community have access to resources, information, and protection. Hayat, over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Carla, for the introduction and for all your efforts in preparing this session. And I also want to thank my colleagues who started with the interventions, and allow me, my intervention will be a kind of completion for what Anna Therese was presenting, and it will be based mainly on my experience as a feminist activist who uses digital media for campaigning work. So as it was mentioned, we all agree that technology has revolutionized how women and girls live their lives. So it has allowed them to practice their online activism, community building, and also access careers, opportunities, and learning, and increasing their awareness and engagement around women's rights issues. So social media also allowed feminist and women's rights movements to expose gender inequalities and violence against women more widely, and also to put pressure on public and private officials to enact a change. However, it is worth remembering that technology and digitalization have its dark side as well, where offline inequalities were permeated online, including misogyny, harassment, hate, stalking, violence. In brief, all types of violence practiced offline are reflected online as yet another patriarchal public space, unfortunately. So in my presentation, I will be highlighting mainly the main opportunities that technology has created for us as women human rights defenders, along with the main challenges we and women and girls we serve are experiencing online. And speaking about opportunities, I want to mention the main opportunities that came with this digitalization. First, we all know that women are still underrepresented represented in media in general. So digital media platforms encouraged a more level of playing field, allowing for the voices of women from different backgrounds and countries with or without traditional power to be heard. Women's rights activists acknowledged the significance that social media can have on drawing the attention of the public, if I can say, to their demands, struggles, and also the diverse issues that constitute dignified presence for them as equal citizens, irrespective of their ethnicity, background.
Hayat, you froze. Your screen has frozen. So Hayat,
gender, religion, age, etc. As in addition to the women and their voices. Yes, Carla.
Hayat, sorry to interrupt you. You froze at some point, and then we lost track of what you said. Could you just rewind just the past few sentences, just a little bit? Thank you.
So I was speaking about how digital media found a solution, if I can say, for the representation of women and women's image in media, where on the online platforms we started seeing different versions of women, and we started hearing different voices irrespective of their backgrounds or their situation. Also, the second point I want to speak about is about digital media as an advocacy tool. As the dependency on digital media grew, independent feminist media platforms and human rights activists began to use it as an influential tool to facilitate their advocacy process, and possessing a notable, if I can say, power to rapidly shape the attitudes and opinions of the public. And digital platforms became women's haven, if I can say, in which they can easily transfer their offline activism to online world, also while collectively and globally linking their causes to one another. Also, one of the main points that I will speak about is how digitalization or digital media provided minorities and vulnerable populations with platforms to defend their rights and make their voices heard and their needs as obvious and clear. So women's rights activists and organizations used social media to get their messages out. Women, girls, refugee women, migrant domestic workers, LGBTQI+ communities, which are the society's populations that usually suffer the most, even though they are the ones with urgent and unmet basic needs. Yet these groups are constantly discriminated at, as you already know, by governments and by the patriarchal systems, and also deprived of attaining their rights and needs. So digital platforms provided them with an opportunity to communicate and exchange information in this regard, using different languages and tools of expression by being the space to amplify the voices of various minorities in the society. Also, digitalization paved the way in a way or another, not only for freedom of expression, but also it's allowed solidarity among all women and girls regionally and globally. With the rise of digital media platforms, women and girls sought a free from restriction and limitations, a space to speak their minds, and also suggest new ideas for their activism, and an arena where they can explicitly fight for their rights as opposed to the oppression in the offline world. Also, I want to mention one final point about the opportunities, because I want briefly to speak about the challenges. One of the opportunities appeared during the COVID-19 pandemic. In Lebanon, as well in other countries and all over the world, at the time of this pandemic and at the time of the restriction of the physical mobility of women and girls, women's rights organizations realized more and more the importance of technology and digital tools to ensure the continuity of their services delivery and support for women in need, even if not in the same equality or accessibility as before, but it was an alternative and a way to keep their services rolling. Finally, and as mentioned in the introduction, so while appreciating tech and digitalization virtues, we have to be aware that they also paved the way for a number of risks. So hurdles to women and girls' digital literacy includes access to affordability, challenges, lack of education, also the socio-cultural norms. We should not neglect the fact that women on global average have fewer digital skills, less presence on online platforms, and less understanding of technology, in addition to being less likely able to access or own mobile or technological devices. And here I'm speaking about the most vulnerable women in rural and vulnerable communities. And I was happy by the statistics presented by Anne-Therese. They are really promising, and I think we should build on. So unfortunately, until this day, not much attention has been paid to the gap in digital literacy, despite its potential to enforce other socioeconomic, political, and security disparities. The involvement in the digital world can also create many risks. at different occasions and actually support at sometimes restrictive norms. I want to give few examples here before I end, Carla. For example, we all remember in Egypt the issue of the TikTok girls who were arrested because they just danced on TikTok. Also in Lebanon, I want to mention that the percentage of reporting on online gender-based violence, like harassment, bullying, extortion, etc., it has increased during the lockdown, the first months of the lockdown, by 180%. Also, 40% of these victims were girls between 12 and 22 years old, and this is a very alarming number. For example, in Saudi Arabia, we had an application called Abshir, for example. It's one of many applications that has been used by men to track women's whereabouts and activities. And there are also many examples of targeting women activists fighting for gender equality through hate, bullying, misogynic comments and campaigns, shaming, exposing personal information, death threats at many times, etc. So in brief, even online where we felt like we could escape the oppression and express ourselves more freely, it became a space also where authorities try to dominate and oppress opinions and freedom of expression. I will end my presentation here, and I will be happy to hear more questions, and if there are some time to some recommendations also. Thank you, Carla.
Thank you, Hayat. I really like the fact that the speakers have brought different angles. We tried not to be repetitive, so we enriched the conversation. So thank you for very interesting points. I just want to share with everyone that building on what you said, Hayat, there is shocking new data that shows the enormity of the digital divide. It's a report that was written by UNICEF and ITU. I can share it with the audience afterwards. So now from Lebanon, we're going to Palestine, and we have Marwa Fatafta with us. She's connected. Can you wave your hand so everyone can see you? Perfect. So Marwa leads Access Now's work on digital rights in the Middle East and North Africa. She's also a policy analyst at Al-Shabaka. Al-Shabaka is the network in Arabic. It is the Palestinian Policy Network. As you can see, she's very young, so I won't say more now, and very quickly hand over the floor to Marwa. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Carla, and thanks everyone for hosting me. And I'm very thrilled and honored to be among you today and among very incredible and impressive women. A disclaimer: I'm not very young, even though I look like it. So I work at Access Now, and for those of you who don't know Access Now, we are a global human rights organization with a mission to extend and defend human rights in the digital age, particularly for those who are most at risk. And I'm afraid that I will be presenting a little bit a somber depiction of reality of women when they log in online and when they exercise their fundamental rights on the internet. So we are a couple of weeks away from marking the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring, which, among many things, have instigated much of the discussion about the role of technology and the internet specifically as a civic space and an essential enabler for the enjoyment of human rights in the digital age. And the region, of course, has a rich and diverse history of women's rights movements and feminist movements. But as highlighted by my fellow panelists before, the internet has enabled women and provided new venues for them to exercise the right to express themselves, to share experiences, to build alliances, whether across the region or with other global movements, and also to bring together or to try to position themselves as feminists with other social and political social justice movements in the region. I was planning to shed light on how the internet and technology provided those opportunities, but given that the presentations before had fantastically highlighted those, I will skip to the challenges. So the persistence of the patriarchal and capitalist system has meant that it's morphed or found ways to morph itself in and seep into the most intimate details of our lives. And that means new forms of oppression, violence, and harassment against women and other gender groups that are outside of the binary setup. So we've talked about the issue of internet connectivity and the digital divide. So it is important again to highlight that to this day, there are many girls and women that are still, either because of their socioeconomic backgrounds or because of their social and cultural background, they are forbidden from their right to access the internet openly and securely. And this becomes more pressing as an issue when many governments in the region are rushing to deploy and launch new technologies to provide services, whether in the form of digitizing government services or by deploying technologies such as digital IDs, which means for those people who are not already on the grid will not be able to have access to those services as the rest of the society. And of course, given the already, let's say, weak position of women economically and politically and socially in our region, in many parts of the MENA region, this puts them at a disadvantage already. And then again, you know, there are women and LGBTQ plus communities are subjected to unprecedented levels of hate and violence online. I mean, whether we like it or not, the internet has become a toxic place for women, and from death and rape threats to doxing, which is sharing private and personal information without the consent of the person. We've seen, for example, private and intimate photos and videos of women being shared, sharing their home addresses, in some cases sharing the pictures and schools of their children in an attempt to exert pain and also exert pressure on them online. We've also, for example, seen in the pandemic how the internet has been used to violate women's privacy in order to shame them into silence in some cases. At Access Now, we have documented an increase in online attacks against LGBTQ plus folks, which unfortunately most of the cases are coming from our region in the MENA region. And to highlight perhaps the best highlight cases of that contrast between the opportunities and the challenges, I want to share with you two case studies from Egypt that we've been working on. One is in July, probably you all know, there have been testimonies of coming from women of rape and sexual harassment that came to surface against one particular person, a student who has been abusing, blackmailing, harassing, and raping women in a serial manner. And there was an Instagram page called the Assault Police that was sharing those testimonies from women. And as a result, within days, the Egyptian public prosecutor moved to arrest and prosecute this individual on charges related to sexually assaulting 3 minors and blackmailing a 4th person. Then later came allegations of against a famous Egyptian investigative journalist who also used his powerful position to lure in young and aspiring female journalists who were looking for opportunities to train their skills and to build their career. And he used that position in order to sexually assault them and harass them. Then came the shocking case of the Vermont Hotel, this luxury Cairo hotel, where 9 men who belong to very influential Egyptian families have drugged a young woman, raped her consecutively, and filmed the act, shared it with their friends. And whilst the public prosecutor was quick to act on the first case of harassment that I mentioned earlier, they, instead of immediately investigating the case of the Vermont Hotel, which was quite shocking for a number of people, they went to smear campaign, using smear campaign online, the women and the witnesses who were part of that scandal, in order to question and delegitimize their credibility as witnesses to the case. And whilst all of this has been happening, and some in the media, some people call it the Egyptian Me Too movement, but that movement that started and empowered a lot of women to come forward and share the stories. At the same time, the Egyptian public prosecutor has been on a mission of arresting, detaining, and prosecuting these young female TikTok influencers, which was mentioned in the presentation before me, on charges of violating Egyptian family values. So at least 3 women have been prosecuted using the controversial cybercrime law for violating Egyptian family values, and received extremely harsh and disproportionate sentences of 2 to 3 years in prison and a fine of almost $19,000 US. And so this is only an example of how the internet, and on the one hand, offer a space for women to express themselves, to build alliances, to come forward and speak up. But at the same time, that space has become heavily monitored and criminalized by the state. And Egypt is just only one example. We've seen in Saudi Arabia, for example, how women rights activists like Lujain al-Hadloul and many others were or has been jailed on bogus charges related to terrorism, simply for calling, for exercising their fundamental rights as women. And we see again and again how the states weaponize social media, either through smear campaigns or troll armies, in order to silence or move women, silence women, and try to crush these social movements. And so, unfortunately, to summarize, the state, in a way, has assumed in our region the role of the male guardian of women also online, which at some point after the Arab Spring, we know that we have, unfortunately, a even worse human rights crisis than before 2011. But it's no longer about prosecuting activists and political dissidents, but journalists and civil society actors and so on, but also anybody now, especially women who dare to cross certain political and social lines, can be prosecuted and, fortunately, jailed and shamed. And that, again, like to end maybe on a more positive note, that brings us to the importance of fighting back to reclaim those spaces as women, and also to take an intersectional approach when we talk about human rights online or human rights in the digital age, to not only to fight those repressive legislations that are such as cybercrime laws or counterterrorism laws that have been used to prosecute women as well, but also to keep or to hold social media companies accountable, because as we try to portray social media companies as spaces that or companies that offer free services or free spaces for women to express themselves and be present online, the business model of those companies, unfortunately, is tailored towards prompting or amping up sensational content, including hate speech and harassment of women for profit. And so we need to somehow all come together, and that's why I'm so happy to participate in this conversation today as women's rights movements and the bigger human rights or digital rights movement, and to push against these new worrying trends in the region. And on that note, I end here, and thank you so much again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Marwa. You've really transported us through your very vivid examples of what's happening to women. And Somehow, just before we start with the Q&A, is technology and digitization a blessing or a curse? We see from all the presentations that we have a platform for women that they never had before, that we can break barriers and cut across silos, ethnicities, backgrounds. At the same time, it's a space that can be toxic, as you said, and that can be risky for women. And the pandemic has exacerbated some of the dark sides of the internet. So fascinating to really cut across the four presentations. Before we open up for the Q&A, the audience has helped me do my role as a facilitator. I was reminded that Hayat Mirshad was awarded just 10 days ago, 25th of November. She was listed on the BBC list for the 100 most influential and inspiring women in the world for 2020. I think she deserves a big round of applause. This is recent, fresh news. Well done. Well done, Hayat. You're representing us all and the men who are on this group supporting us. And without further ado, I will open up the floor for Q&A. And maybe as an icebreaker, we already have a very thoughtful comment from Omar Dana, who is putting this on the table for discussion. So let me read it. Women in the MENA region face structural, constitutional, and legal barriers and lack of access to justice, policy, and institutional challenges, lack of governmental commitment to gender-sensitive public policies, economic limitations from equally accessing market and jobs and technological tools, along with political, social, and cultural constraints that prevent them from achieving their needs and interests. Current regional trends are prioritizing the global perspectives of donors and international actors such as gender, peace and security agenda, women's leadership and political participation, women access to the economy, women's access to health, especially to sexual and reproductive health and rights, SRHR, and women's access to justice. To what extent, and that's the question, women leaders, some of you who are here, perceive such trends as reflecting their own priorities, needs and rights, especially women refugees, IDPs, and the most marginalized women in protracted conflict areas such as Palestine, Syria, Yemen, Libya, and others. So thank you, Omar, for this comment and question. I'll open up now to our speakers with a couple of reflections, and please, then we open up to the entire audience. You can raise your hand. I'll try to see the entire screen, or type your question or comment in the chat box. So over to our speakers. Who would like to just give a few pointers to the comment made by Omar? Over to you. Hayat, you seem ready.
Okay, yes. I don't know if I captured the point that Omar is trying to reach, but I wanted to comment on the issue of priorities. And here I have a big problem with the issue of priorities, because thanks for Omar for highlighting the issue of trends. We are used in our region that trends are usually set by international organizations and international donors. And if I can say, they are set for us, and we are obliged to follow in a way or another, especially when it comes to funding opportunities and etc. Because after all, women's rights organizations and feminist groups and etc. they need resources in order to sustain this work. So for me, I believe that when it comes to priorities and to setting the needs, I'm totally against this kind of trends. I'm totally with ensuring that women and girls and the LGBTQI+ community people and refugees and etc. are the ones who set their priorities. Because even though maybe we have Lebanon, Palestine, Egypt, Jordan, maybe we can consider security one of our priority areas. But each of us has its own context and its own challenges, if we can say. And the women in these communities and the girls and other groups have their own challenges and context and needs. So the way that the priorities to be set, for me, these need to come from the community and to come from the people that these international organizations are supposedly serving.
Thank you, Hayat. That's a very interesting point on the bottom-up approach to this. Any other comment, Marwa, Anna Therese? Would you like to come in, Marwa?
Yeah, sure. I mean, as a feminist, I am a bit critical of this approach or presumption that when you have women leaders or having a higher participation of women in top decision-making posts or positions, that it means that would somehow automatically translate into prioritizing women's issues such as education, access to health, and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, I don't believe that's true. And I do agree with Hayat that the approach needs to be different. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that the answer to changing those structural problems is not having women leaders who might help ease the inequities and inequalities that exist. I do believe in empowering grassroots women and giving agencies to the communities, as Hayat said, to set their own priorities and also to take part in changing the structure. Until this patriarchal system remains in place, it's just a matter of either elevating or exacerbating this crisis, depending on the economic situation, or as we see now, the health situation. It's just like tuning up and down the volume while the issues persist. And so I again, I am a true believer, and I just want to emphasize that in allowing women and in other vulnerable communities to be in charge of their own and their own lives.
Thank you, Marwa. A beautiful lesson on empowerment. Over to you, Anna Therese.
Excuse me, I'm unmuting. I would just echo what the co-panelists said. I think, movements everywhere have to do a power analysis of where their resources are coming from. And I think that's a challenge everywhere in the world with radical intersectional social justice movements looking for funding and resourcing from structures that are capitalist or patriarchal. So I guess where I see the opportunity is for movements to be, keep this in mind and be, strategic in maintaining their agency and, entering these relationships with open eyes.
Thank you, Anna Therese. I think the audience is keen on asking questions. It's hard for me to see the entire screen, so I'm going to look at the chat box, but I don't see any question here. There are just a few comments. Can you just raise your hand and I will look across the three screens. Any questions, comments, ideas to feed into this fascinating discussion? So we have a question. No, we have a comment. Okay, we have a question from Phil Evans. What realistic balance can be struck between government regulation for the internet and the failure of big tech to prevent abuse on their platforms? And I would add the whole notion of data protection that is busying everyone. Shall we take that one? Who would like to take it? We'll try to keep it interactive. Marwa, go ahead.
I can start. Yeah, I mean, so I guess it's a very difficult question, I have to say. I think right now it's the $1 million question that everyone who's working on tech policy and digital rights is trying to grapple with and answer. So while there are no shortcuts to this and there's no magical solution, I think the most important thing when governments are trying to regulate the internet or deploy new technologies to ensure that the fundamental rights of users are at their very core. And the main rights are people's right to freedom of expression, the right to the protection of personal data, which is kind of a branch of the right to privacy, in order to ensure that when such technology is being used, we don't have detrimental impact on people's rights. Unfortunately, and that's what COVID-19 has highlighted, governments often rush to deploy new technologies in a tech solutionism fashion, thinking that once you deploy a contact tracing app, for example, during this current pandemic, or having a mobile app for this service or that, somehow you are able to provide services to citizens. Often all of that deployment comes with no public consultation, specifically in our region, with no transparency about these applications, and when it comes to data protection, for example, how invasive are they? What kind of data do they collect about us? Who do they share these data with? For how long do they save that data? And also thinking again, with everything that they know about us when we use the internet and leave behind us these shadows of ourselves in the forms of data, what safeguards do they have in place to ensure that malicious actors, whether it be governments or private actors that are interested in our data for many reasons, either for profit or for espionage and spying, how can they save our data? So all of that is, unfortunately, often it takes the back seat, and what we see is just scandals upon scandals of systems being hacked and personal data of citizens being sold on the dark web, for example, or as simple as just, for example, in Morocco, members of the LGBT community were outed on the internet and against their will, and their private photos were shared on social media companies. And unfortunately, some of them had to be kicked out of their home and disowned by their families in the middle of a pandemic and during lockdown. Now, against the background of all of that, the backdrop, while governments are prioritizing repressive laws, as the ones I mentioned, there are very little or not even existing robust, for example, data protection laws that ensure the rights of those affected can be remedied, for example, or safeguarded. Now, when we talk about the role of social media companies, that's another discussion. In the US right now, there are discussions about amending Section 230. For those who are following the discussion, it's a discussion around how to hold social media companies accountable based on the content that users share on those platforms, which to this point, they've always kept a distance. They haven't tackled really the issue of disinformation or online hate speech, even though they are trying, but these attempts are distant from the human rights framework. In Europe, there are discussions about breaking down the big tech as well through competitive and antitrust laws. So there are many current discussions about how to find the right balance between allowing those tech companies providing free services and for users to be able to exercise their rights, while at the same time safeguarding those rights. So I hope this answers your question, and I leave the floor for other panelists if they wish to answer.
Maybe before we go to the other panelist, Amani was on video and had a question and comment. I don't know if she can be back with us or if she's moved away. Amani is with us. Over to you, Amani.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the speaker. And thank you, Carla, also. Actually, I had a comment and a question on the issue of women in leadership, because I still believe that women, it's a prerequisite for women empowerment to have women in leadership, because as I mentioned in my comment, women are in a better position to know about their needs and their priorities. And I also mentioned that for me, instead of asking why to have women in leadership, I ask why not to have women in leadership, because as a feminist and as in a women movement, of course, we believe that women are equally capable, if not better than men in leading and being in decision-making position. So we all know what women are experiencing, especially in MENA region. women are being intentionally excluded from decision-making process, although women are always in the front lines responding to the crisis, and also being part and the first respondents to the conflicts, to the war, intifada, COVID crisis. But when it comes to leadership, men only decide who is to take this leadership, and it's only exclusive to men. So it's also our role to change this stereotype and to widen this arena, to also to have women lead it beside men. Yeah, thank you so much. I also want to emphasize on the points also mentioned by Marwa and Hat. Thank you, everyone. It was really, it's all touching on very prominent issues, especially when it comes to our region. So we all share that maybe the same struggle with differences due to the context. But of course, we are all here elevating our voices as one voice, requesting gender equality and gender justice before. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amani, for a wonderful intervention. We have, I don't know if our colleague from the MENA Forum would like to take the floor. Please go ahead. I could see you waving from far away.
I'm the eternal student. Teacher, call on me. Teacher, come on. I have a question. I have a question for all of you. Perhaps it's for a larger discussion, but I just wondered, and I'm not the first person to wonder this, if it would be perhaps possible to create a nonprofit social media platform that would be non-capitalist and not controlled by the big companies, Silicon Valley and all its minions. So that's my question. Has anybody thought of that? And if not, could that perhaps be an outgrowth of this forum today, or some discussion of it at least?
Over to the panelists. Very thought-provoking question. Who has thought about designing such a platform? Over to you. Anna Therese, maybe? Would you like to start?
Oh, I'm unmuted. I don't have an answer on that. So I might throw this to another panelist, although, yeah, we could certainly use it. I did want to go back to something Marwa was saying about the issue with the platforms right now. And I did just want to add, I think this is there's such an important role for civil society everywhere. This technology is ricocheting in horrific ways around the world right now. And we certainly can't rely on governments governments in different parts of the world are using it for bad intentions in many different ways in every different context. But I do think that this is a kind of moment because there at least is finally discussion about regulation to bring up how these different contexts, the kind of stories that were raised today are really affecting different regions. There are parallels, but there are distinct stories everywhere. And this kind of theme of disinformation, hate speech, but in every context around the world, there is a disproportionate cost of being online to women, whether it be sexual harassment or just the online misogyny and harassment that we see. So again, I just think this is absolutely a role for civil society to keep being very loud about these issues, but it's very much a feminist issue that we see everywhere.
Thank you, Anna Therese. Hayat, you seem ready to intervene.
Yes,
and if
I
it's
was
designed
trying to
by
think about the question, Carla. Same as Anna Therese, I really don't have a clear answer, but I want to say something. And I was thinking about a certain point that every time we are asked as women and girls to find the alternatives that are isolated from the whole, if I can say, majority or world. So now these digital media platforms and social media platforms are very popular. All people are there. They, as I mentioned, they provided spaces to reach more audience, to interact, to etc. So I don't think that it is our role as women and feminists to look for alternatives as much as it is, as Marwa mentioned, our role to hold these big companies accountable when it comes to women's presence and women's issues. So I think that we need to reclaim these spaces. I know that we spent all our lives fighting and reclaiming spaces, but we need to keep on doing this for the coming generations. If you allow me, Carla, before we hear Marwa's opinion on this, I just want to give example on what Amani mentioned. And this is really a very important point when speaking about women in leadership. And since you are Lebanese, you will relate a little bit. I want to give a recent example in Lebanon, and in order to stress the point that Amani said on the importance of having women in leadership positions, not only because it is our right to be present there, but also to ensure that our priorities are, maybe the basic priorities are there. So in Lebanon, and it's not a joke, by the way, and when they wanted to set an emergency plan to set their priorities for after COVID-19 and the economic crisis, they formed a committee, and this committee was formed of 7 men, believe it or not, no women on the table. And these men sat and decided on the goods that they want to subsidize to control the inflated prices of the basic items in the market. So they compiled a list of 300 items, but somehow they failed to include the period pads. At the time during period, poverty was prevailing in Lebanon. And naturally, what they didn't forget was the men's razors. So this is one of the examples, just to say that when women are not there on the table, these basic priorities, I am sure, despite who is the woman there, okay, and if she is feminist or not, I'm sure when it comes to such a decision, she will remember the issues that are related to the sexual and reproductive and bodily and health issues related to women. So just I wanted to mention. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you, Hayat. This is also a very compelling example from Lebanon. And I think it's in between from what we're hearing here. We need to be in the seats, in the executive leadership seats to be able to influence, but we need the grassroots voices to be loud and heard and to generate that movement. So I guess to the question, it's both, but let's hear from Marwa on this. And then we have Renee, who has a question for you in the chat box that I will relay. Marwa, over to you.
Thank you, Carla. I think, yeah, it's an excellent question. And trust me, every day in my job, once I hear stories of how Facebook, Twitter, and co are silencing activists and taking arbitrary measures, suspending accounts, or just, and especially for our region, they systematically have chosen to deprioritize fighting disinformation, hate speech, and often tend to crack down on political dissent in the region. And we have been trying for years, calling on those companies to take into consideration the regional, political, and cultural, as well as the linguistic context before they take such measures that are unfortunately impacting and harming people's rights. So every day I think we need an alternative. But as Carla said, as Hayat said, there is, of course, some discussion and thinking on autonomous alternatives, not necessarily for women, but also for activists. And again, the basic thing here is having the non-for-profit model, because the main issue with those companies is their business model and how they are established. They are machines that harvest our personal and private data. They commodify our private and emotional experiences. They have a price tag on that. They share it with advertisers, and that's how they manage to offer us their services for free. And that's where we need to focus our work on, in changing that business model. And even if they continue to be for-profit companies, I don't think they would ever change. But to ensure, while they are being the most profitable companies in the history of humankind, they adhere to human rights principles and to international law. They have an obligation under the UN guiding principles on human rights, on business and human rights. So that's, I think, where the discussion is at the moment. And I And yeah, and then again, the reality is everybody's there. Everybody's there. And if you're not on that platform, you're out of a conversation, you're out of the discussion. And then emphasizing on Hayat's points, you know, we don't want to create a planet for us as women and remain there on silos, even though sometimes I like this idea, but that's not the point, right? So I hope this answers your question.
Thank you, Marwa. Beautifully said. And maybe also to think about, I know there's some thinking around Geneva Conventions for cyber, Geneva Conventions for the internet. This is a topic that's being discussed in other fora. We have a question from Renee, so I'll relay that question. How does the feminist movement positively support other human rights movements in the region, such as the frequently mentioned LGBTQI+ movement? Over to you. Hayat, are you ready?
Yes, I think for me, I think that the feminist movement, in order to be feminist, and this is the difference between saying that we are a women's rights organization or a women's rights movement and a feminist movement. So feminist movement believes in intersectionality. So for us, for example, as female and other feminist organizations in Lebanon, intersectionality is one of the main values that we believe in, and that's why the fight for LGBTQI+ communities is in the core of our values and our work, the same as the fight for every woman and girl, because this is something related to the bodily rights, related to the sexual rights, and also the right for the person to decide on him or herself what do they need. So for me, I think, yes, the feminist movement works towards, if I can say, fighting all these kinds of injustices that intersect in different ways. And when we smash patriarchy, we will be also saving the whole planet, including the LGBTQI+ community. So.
Thank you, Hayat. I'll go to Anna Therese. Just to remind everyone, we have 5 minutes left, even less. Anna Therese, over to you, and then we'll nicely wrap up.
I'll be brief, but in terms of some specifics, what I've seen in terms of that collaboration is obviously the digital space is incredibly important to the LGBTQ community, as physical safety is such a barrier. But of course, those digital spaces can be abused to identify and then extort or abuse and blackmail LGBTQ individuals. In terms of the collaboration that I've seen most commonly, I've seen feminist organizations as allies with access to resources, whether in terms of services or in terms of safety, and like from safe houses to legal support and resources. So that's where I see, or I've seen the allyship existing from online to offline real world resources.
Thank you, Anna Therese. I'm conscious of time. We have 2 minutes left. I will take this opportunity to really thank everyone for an impressive conversation. I am sure there are more questions and thoughts taking place in your minds. This was very inspiring. It will be hard to wrap up in 2 minutes. What I can say is what we see is that it's all in the nuances. It's all about the grassroots aspect and the top-down interventions coming together. We need a systems intervention. We know that the algorithms are designed primarily by men. So how do we influence at the beginning of the design of those algorithms? You've talked about STEM education. How can we increase that in the region? I mean, fascinating discussion that I will not be able to do justice to. What I would like to say is a very warm thank you to all of you, wherever you are across the world, and to Webster University for organizing this fascinating panel. I will stay in touch. I will share with you the report I talked about. If any of you have assets to share, documents, reports, interesting articles for us to read, please bring them to the table, and I'm sure there will be an interesting pickup by the group. Thank you, everyone. We would have liked to hear more about the questions in the minds of the men participating, but it was a primarily women-led session. So an honor and privilege for me to have facilitated it. Thank you to all of you. Have a great day and happy holidays. Thank you. Over to the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carla, if I can call you that. I'm Mary Valma, and I'm your student, so thank you. And thank you. That was really an excellent session, and we profited from it immensely. And now it's nice to have these little pauses. We'll have a pause for 15 minutes, and then we'll come back at 3:45 for our fourth and final panel, which is on feminism and international organizations in the age of COVID, reimagining the future. See you then. Thank you.